Hello and welcome to what hopefully will be a part two of this episode. I had a blue screen of death. Everything restarted out of nowhere. But there is a file I think I can recover, and if so, I will do that. And if I can't recover it, then this is just going to be a short episode. Hopefully I can, though, because it was a really cool conversation. I don't know. And if not, I guess we can redo it. But I got emotional. It was embarrassing. Just kidding. But it was important stuff about reasons we believe, about people who walk away from the faith, and why, given my history and position, it'd be impossible for me to do that. And I don't understand people who go through seasons of doubting and people who walk away from the faith. It just doesn't make sense to me because my reasons for believing are just way too strong, tied into my history, the story I tell myself about myself and my situation, my current life. So much of it is based off of what God's done for me, and I've just seen his presence in my life so clearly for so long. Like, even my first memories about my life and period are about becoming saved. So but I know everyone isn't like that, but that's besides the case. Hopefully it'll all be in that first video. I'll be able to tie them both together. What I did, the second thing I want to talk about was, it's kind of, I almost want to call it silly, because it's not really a great argument, but it's one that I was thinking about and actually interacted with on it's one of Stratton's points again, because that guy's always talking about, it's called the greatest premise in the history of argumentation is what he describes it as. But it's kind of interesting. So the first point is, if God determines all things about humanity, then God determines all Christians to have some false theological intuitions and to hold some false theological beliefs. I would agree with that, right? True.
Yeah, that's not the greatest premise, though.
Yeah, so here's the greatest premise. So if God determines all Christians to have some false theological intuitions and to hold some false theological beliefs, then God is deceptive. His word, aka the Bible, cannot be trusted, and Christians cannot have assurance of salvation. And that is a huge jump to me. But before we dig into it, let's finish the points. He would say, God is not deceptive, his word can be trusted, and Christians can have assurance of salvation. I'm like, okay, good, we're back on board. Therefore, God does not determine all Christians to have some theological intuitions and to hold some theological beliefs. That's not true. Therefore, God does not determine all things about humanity. So basically, if you're a determinist and you have some false beliefs about God, which literally everyone does, then determinism can't be true because God's not deceptive. That is just rock solid, right? The problem is, is that God determining something and God being that is what is determined are not the same thing. Like, God can determine you to have false beliefs without being deceptive. I think that that's a very basic idea. And I posted this question in our theological group. And I think there was one person who didn't even outright agree with the statement, but was like, oh, I could see how that would be true. Everyone else is like, well, it depends on the mechanisms of determinism. Like, what do you mean by determines? Because that's what always matters in these conversations. And I think that for Stratton in particular, that when I've had conversation with him, that's where it always comes up to. It's like, well, how is he determining these things? Because I can easily say God allows people to have false beliefs about him. He's like, oh, but that's not determinism. I'm like, yeah, it is determinism. Because
a different variety of determinism.
Exactly. It's like by deficient means, like he can let you believe wacky stuff. And even when I spoke to Stratton and I pointed this out to him, we decided that what we can be sure of is what's in the Bible. The theological points that are made in the Bible that can be clearly read and understood are things that we can't disagree on. So if you have a theological belief that is in direct contradiction with the Bible, I would easily call that false, and I'd easily say that that's definitely not from God. You're being stupid. But everything that's not explicit in the Bible is all guesswork. Even this conversation we're having right now is guesswork. And people are going to have a wide variety of beliefs about things that aren't explicit in the Bible. Some of them might be true, some of them might be wrong. We don't know. All we know is that God determined us to not really know the truth about these things. In a general sense, but in a more specific sense, I think he's determining us to believe what we want about these things. That, you know, whether it's determinism or open theism or Molinism, whatever the case, at least to me, I don't think God has made it obvious one way or another. So it's kind of up to us to what we think about these things. And they'd be like, well, that's not determinism. You can't say that as a determinist. I'm like, well, yeah, I can, because God can let me through deficient means by not influencing my decision making to believe a certain way about something through my own intuition and my own faculties. I can make up my mind. Fallen. Yes, that are already fallen. So I'm very comfortable as a determinist saying, like, God determined me to think this way, right? Well, right. What if you're wrong? Are you correct in your theological beliefs? No, I'm extremely uncertain about it. And not like, I don't know if I believe this or if I'm sure of it. Like, I'm pretty sure of it, but my salvation doesn't depend on it. And if I was told wrong, I would still be a Christian. And I'd be like, well, okay, I guess I got that wrong. I'm going to, preach this for the rest of my days, which at some point might happen in my life. And if it does, praise God, I'll be better for it. And if not, then I'll just keep doing this. But the point is, that doesn't make God deceptive. What God determines and what God is are not equivalents, right? And the premise and the second premise that he called the greatest premise in argumentation in history, God determines all Christians have some theological beliefs, then God is deceptive. And my argument to him was, well, God determined a lot of things in the Bible, but that doesn't make him those things. Like, I brought up the plagues of Egypt. God determined the firstborn of all, the nation to pass away. God is not a murderer, though. God determined Jesus to die on the cross. God didn't murder Jesus. God determined that all of the earth be wiped out in the flood. Does that make him, a bringer of genocide? God determined Israel to be destroyed by Babylon and Assyria. Does that make God a warmonger? And the point boiled down to, you either allow God to determine things without being morally culpable for those things, or God didn't determine those things, period, in the first place at all.
Yeah, I think you have to look at is God's nature, who he is, his goodness, his omnibenevolence, his omnipotence, and his giving of good gifts, being the gift giver of salvation and life and love and eternal bliss with him as a relationship. All those things that God is, specifically God being love, with God determining certain things, is God's omnipotence, is omnibenevolence compatible with him determining certain things of humanity? And really, what the argument that Stratton is trying to press, or his lack of support, whatever the premise that he calls the greatest premise in the history of argumentation, that premise does not get us to the incompatibility claim that he's wanting.
Yeah, exactly.
So it doesn't show us that God's determination is necessarily incompatible with being. Or, in more specific terms, God's seemingly deceptive determination, which is what we would call intuitively a bad thing, in determining false theological beliefs, that bad thing that premise does not show us that that bad thing of him determining deceptive theological beliefs in his humanity is incompatible necessarily with God's omnibenevolence. And that's what he needs to show.
Yeah.
And I think I think there's many examples in the Bible. I think the crucifixion's the best one for me. If God clearly determined the crucifixion, does that mean he's a murderer? Well, no. Well, Christ was the one who volunteered it. Yeah, but is there ever a possible world in which God could actualize, in which Christ does not come on the scene and
Well,
die?
if the Jews
I would say
accepted him,
no.
he wouldn't
He
have had to
will
die.
always die.
If the Jews accepted him as their savior and king, we'd be, living in the kingdom of God
And
right
then
now,
everyone
right?
sings Kumbaya, and then sin is eradicated. No.
Yeah, exactly.
But the idea is, no, that doesn't make him a murderer, right? But here we see in Isaiah 53:10, and I'm just quoting it. It pleased me to crush him.
Yeah.
God, the Father, saying, it pleased me to crush the Son, to kill the Son. Now, he killed the Son. He was a sufficient reason, I would say, for Christ dying on the cross. Does that make God a murderer? No, because killing is different than murdering.
Yeah. Well, when you say thou
The
shalt not
Romans were the ones
murder,
who killed Jesus, and the Jews were the ones who killed Jesus.
yeah. When you say thou shalt not murder, it's described as taking a life with little regard or without caring about it. Like it's like
Right.
a flippant decision to like take someone's life.
Right,
So
and I
that's
think
different than
this is
war and defending yourself. I would say that's not murder.
this is one thing that I brought up to him, actually on that same thread, where I brought up to him and said, intentions here matter, and you can't
Yeah,
just say that intentions don't, because the compatibilist is going to come back and they're just say intentions matter here, just like God determining Joseph to be set in slavery. He intended it for good, but everyone else intended it for evil. And that word
exactly.
intention is the exact same Hebrew word. So that means God can determine something in one way in which his human creatures, although the same determination is happening, have determined it for a different way. I brought up intentions, and he responds back almost hilariously, saying, well, my argument has nothing to do with intentions. Right. So what? Who
Yeah,
cares? I am saying that you are not defending your argument properly enough because it doesn't allow for differing intentions. And so
yeah.
that's a weak spot in the premise. And by the way, anyone who's listening, he has in fact, and we have screenshots, has
Mhm.
in fact called that premise literally one of the best, most glorious premises on all argumentation's history. Like actually, like really, like he actually said that.
That's
So the
part of why
pride that goes into saying something like that is flabbergasting,
I think it's
honestly.
funny, but part of why I thought about it so much was, first of all, that was just a wild thing to say. And even the first like even inkling I've ever heard of Stratton is him calling the Calvinist determinist God a deity of deception. So him basically saying you worship a demon is basically what he was saying without saying it.
Right.
And he's still been on that kick or that thought for so long still. And it sucks too, because we've had conversations in person where he's just like, you know what, I think you're a really strong believer, and I see that the faith is extremely important to you, and you have like a mind of a pastor about all these great things to me. And in the conversation, I'm like, we're so close to agreeing with each other. It's just these very little insignificant points that I'm fine with being left unresolved. But then he goes around and still says that the God that I believe in is a deity of deception, which is, it's just a slap in the face every time I hear that. Because we can disagree, but I'm never going to say, oh, if you're an open theist, you worship a God who is a deity of like no power and no like you have faith in a demonic being or blah blah blah. Like
Zeus.
yeah, like all this
Actually,
crap.
Tyler Vela is very popular for calling the open theist God basically analogous to Zeus.
Yeah, I would never say that. That's
I've
just me
never
though.
said it either, but
But
I'm just saying.
but the point is that it's you can't have your pie and eat it too, because I've heard him say that God has determined a lot of things. Maybe even God has determined most things. But if you have the ability to make a free decision at any point in your life, then you have free will. Like, you only have to make one free will decision at one point in your life for him to consider you having free will, which is very easy, like, thing to accomplish and to think. Like, that's, I mean, obviously from the Bible, he would say that there's a lot of things determined. But that is separate from his character. So you get into what Coleman's talking about. Well, what are the motivations for him doing these acts? Because really, that's what's important. If God has a good motivation, then it doesn't really matter what the action is if the motivation is pure. And I would say no matter what God does, even if it seems extremely heinous, I can confidently say that it's for good reasons and his intentions are pure, and that what he's doing isn't evil, just based on what I see from the Bible. Like, how dare the clay question the potter? Like, who are you to even ask me these questions in Romans 9? Like, I'll have mercy on whom I have mercy. Like, he's going to do what he wants and you can't question it. I personally hold that thought. But when I was discussing this online, somebody, Drew, was saying, like, that's special pleading, which he's right. He's like, just because it's God and you have all these assumptions about God, you can say that his intentions are pure, but that's only because he is God. And I'm like, yeah, well, I feel like if special pleading when we're talking to humans matters, but when you're talking about a God who is so far above our understanding, I feel like that's the only way you could talk about him. Any discussion about God is going to involve special pleading because he's a special character.
Yeah, and I think Bignon has something similar, but very actually, like, almost mapped on exactly to what you are saying right now. He's very similar kind of idea that because he's a particular agent, we have to see him with particular powers and
Yes.
particular things, where it's like it is not wrong for God to necessarily wipe out all of humanity and then say, I promise never to do it again. But for us, it would be.
Yeah.
Even if we had the most pure intentions,
Even if we
we
were
just don't have,
Thanos.
yeah, we just don't have that power, right? And so God is a particular agent with particular powers, and if anything's going to be special pleading, I think it should be with that, and that shouldn't be a logical fallacy. But I also like to say that if we all believe in the Bible, then why is God special pleading to begin with? So
Exactly.
if we're talking with another Christian and we all looking at the exact same text, God crucified or God killed Jesus. He didn't murder him, but he was the sufficient reason for why Jesus went to the cross.
Yep.
Or Joseph's being sent into slavery. What was the sufficient reason?
The children
Well,
of Egypt
God
being
intended
killed.
it,
Yeah.
right? He intended it for slavery, and so that he could rescue his
And
people.
and
That's a good thing.
I told you, I asked him, how would you, as an open theist, morally justify what happened there? I didn't get an answer. I'll have to check, but I'm pretty sure he didn't answer that. But as an atheist, I could see you making that argument, being like, why would I believe in a God who does things like this? Like, that's a horrible thing. Like, we could never do that. And I would have to concede that point to them. I'd be like, you're right. We could never do that. But, like, because they're God, and this is where the point where you get into, like, you're using the Bible as your evidence for God being a good character, but it's God who wrote the Bible so he can paint himself in whatever light he wants. As an atheist, that is perfectly fine for you to think, right? But if you're a fellow believing Christian, you have to, I almost feel like you have to concede the point that we can special plead about God because he's a special character or he's a particular agent. And we have to, how Benyon said it, I don't know the words, but we have to consider him in a particular light. But it's an interesting discussion because if you were having this with an atheist, if I were an atheist, that would be my throat punch move. I'd be like, oh, God's morally perfect, then why did he have to kill all the firstborn? He already made them suffer so much. Why did he have to do that extra step and put it over the edge? Oh, well, he's using their own laws against them. And Pharaoh was still steadfast in his not letting them go. And this was the only thing that would have let it happen. Yeah, but God hardened his heart. God was the reason he took it that far, even says so in the Bible. So why did he do it? That's a hard question to answer if you're a Christian without sounding like you're special pleading. I mean, I could give all sorts of BS answers. I can make them up and be like, well, if that particular generation of Egyptians survived, maybe they would have cannibalized themselves and the Egyptians would have never been a great civilization, or they would have introduced some type of disease that would have wiped out the whole world, or they would have had the next Hitler. Would you kill baby Hitler if you knew they were going to be Hitler? Well, God actually did that, maybe. Like, God actually killed, who knows? Your imagination can go crazy with how you answer that question. The
Right.
point is that if you're a believer, it's not exactly important to know why that happened. But if you're an atheist, that sounds like a ridiculous thing to say. So that's when we get into the problem of evil. I think the main goal of this podcast and what we've been talking about is, as a theist, we are all on the same team when it comes to this problem of evil. The issues determinists have are more or less the same issues every other theological camp has, especially if you're talking to atheists.
Right.
So we shouldn't be bickering amongst ourselves. We should be working to have good answers, even if they're different answers, but good answers for atheists on wherever theological camp you lie on. That, I don't know. It was interesting thought experiment to think how an atheist would think about that, how a Christian would explain it to them, and how ridiculous it all sounds if you really think about it.
Yeah. I mean, I agree pretty much 100%. I don't think that premise two, follows in his argument. It is a disastrous premise. He doesn't show it to be the case. And even, and this is just rhetorically the horrible thing that Stratton tries to produce, is he doesn't understand dialectical context. And so he doesn't understand that if I were to reconstruct his premise to even be better, and then I then defeat that like if I actually steel man the premise, well, let's think about this premise this way, so that's a little bit better. But then if I say, okay, well, even if I make it better and it still fails, a fortiori, which is Latin from the stronger, that's what it means. So from the stronger, it just follows that your argument that's weaker will obviously fail. But he doesn't understand that, because if I try to even make the premise stronger, you know what he retorts back hilariously? He retorts back, "Well, that's not my premise," or "That's not what I'm talking about." And you can see that especially when I bring in intentions. Intentions is exactly, well, one of them, but not the only one, but primarily the thing that the compatibilist is going to bring up.
Yep.
So not the only thing that they're going to bring up, but primarily the thing that they're going to bring up to defeat the premise. And I have no idea what's going on in his head when he says, well, premise, like, intentions have nothing to do with my argument. Yes, right. I am trying to make it better, that I'm showing that your premise has a hole because it doesn't account for that.
Yeah.
Well, your intentions are still determined anyways, or God, I don't know. I don't know what
Well,
the junkie
the
said,
way
but
the
it's
way I
just
think about
ridiculous.
it is that, okay, let's just take the premise to its logical conclusion. You could literally take anything from the Bible, some situations we just talked about, Jesus dying on a cross, so God is a murderer. God allowing Babylon and Assyria to destroy Israel, God's a murderer. Like, God allowing the flood, God is a genocidal, like, maniac. Like, the story of Job. Like, these are things that we can clearly see God acted and did. Therefore, you could say God determined, and they would bring up reasons. Well, the world was wicked, that's why he destroyed it. I'm like, well, we can apply that same logical justification to people who believe false things about God. Like, we're
Right.
idiots. We don't study his word carefully. We don't think about it enough. We don't meditate it on enough. Like, that's why we come up with false theological beliefs. That's not logical determinism. Yeah, it is. It's completely in line with it. Like, and my point was, you either actually believe that premise to its fullest extent, and if you did, I would say, why are you a Christian? Because that would make God a moral monster that has no like equivalency in literature. If you want to say all the things that happened and God determined are also he's morally accountable for, that's a heinous thought to me. Or you don't really think that God determines everything and that, he's an open theist type and goes with the flow. Okay, I can accept that. Or the third option would be, well, God does determine everything, but he's not necessarily morally culpable for all things. So it's one of those things. God determines all things. He's not morally culpable. God determines all things. He is morally culpable. Or God doesn't determine all things, so he isn't morally culpable. It's one of those three options. It has to be. So if you're not willing to accept that God doesn't determine anything, then you have to be willing to accept that he's not morally culpable for all things too. I feel like that makes perfect sense. I don't know what else you could come up with, but it was just one of those things where at the end of the day, I'm just sick of being told by a quote unquote popular Christian apologist who's, off doing seminars and preaching at colleges, and who I have my friends from Grace are in the same rooms as him. And they think he's this awesome leader, and I'm sure he is, but like, stop telling me that I worship a lying, deceptive demon, please, on your platforms. Like, can we just talk about this like normal adults without saying I worship a demon? That's all I ask for. And this premise is just his best argument for it. And there's also the argument too that I wanted to mention, where if I even deliberate or think about this thing for myself and have an opinion one way or another, the fact of me even thinking about it demonstrates that I have the free will to think about it, which means I have free will, which means determinism is false. So if you even deliberate, think about, and develop arguments against Stratton, all you're really doing is showing that Stratton is right, because you're making a decision for yourself, and it's a different conclusion than him, so we must have free will. That's another thing he would say. Imagine telling someone, just the fact that you're arguing with me right now means that I'm right.
Yeah, it's
I
just
wish
the
it was that
epitome of
easy,
question
right?
begging. And so my friend Jonathan, actually our friend, because you're in the same chat, right? So our friend Jonathan is writing a review in which he calls the free thinking argument a transcendental, ambitious argument. What that means is it is transcendentally necessary to be true. Like there's no other way to do it. But in order to prove that something is just conceptually and logically transcendental is notoriously difficult. This is why presuppositionalists in the apologetics community are constantly ridiculed, because they do just that. And however you think about apologetics, this is a huge area of controversy. So even if he's right, he doesn't appreciate just how controversial the argument actually is. And because he doesn't do that, he doesn't defend it adequately. So that's the first thing I like to say. The same thing I like to say is that I really don't think, because in the same article, he thinks that, we're begging the question. But what you just said just reveals how much he is begging the question.
Exactly.
And I mean, part of the article where the argument's found is in response to me and Minata. Minata is another Calvinist, determinist who would pretty much more or less fall along our same camp here. And he's accusing us, you, me, any determinists, for question begging by appealing to those same rational cognitive faculties in order to deny his argument. Because then it just vindicates his argument, even implicitly or tacitly. And then you're begging the question because you have to use your cognitive faculties, basically assuming that you're free, libertarianly free, to use your cognitive faculties in order to argue against my premise, which then just proves my premise. And I'm
Exactly.
saying none of that follows.
It's so funny. It's so secular
The
too.
reason why that I want to have everyone appreciate this. The reason why is because how can someone beg the question when it's not even their question that they're bringing up? In other words, it is Stratton's argument that is put on the table. He is the one looking at the question and seeing whether or not we should see if God's omnibenevolence is compatible with his determining false theological beliefs. And he says it's not, so therefore God's not deceptive and he doesn't determine false theological beliefs. It's his argument that concludes that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so he is questioning the argument, or he is questioning that conclusion. And he's presenting an argument against God's omnibenevolence being compatible with God determining deceptive, false theological beliefs or whatever. So, because it's his argument, he is the only one in the dialectic that can beg the question. The only one. I have no idea why and how, if it's not my argument, how a determinist can actually beg the question when they don't even agree with the argument.
Yeah.
So
Well,
to see it
so
like this,
go ahead, finish up.
I want to give an analogy, and I think this is going to be very helpful. So to see it, use the U.S. court system. So there's a defense attorney and a prosecuting attorney. Which one has the burden? Prosecuting attorney. He has the burden.
They have to show
So
that
the
the
defense
defendant's
attorney,
guilty.
yeah. So he has to, the prosecution has to show that that the defendant is guilty without reason, without any doubt. So beyond reasonable doubt, he is guilty. Now, the defense attorney, even if he knows, because of client privilege, even if he knows that the defendant is in fact guilty, he can still just make up a story. He doesn't even need to believe the story, but he can just make up a story and provide skeptical doubt in the prosecution's argument to show that he is not guilty because the prosecution hasn't proven that he's guilty. What is the defense attorney doing? He's not begging the question. What he's doing is he understands that it's the prosecution's job to show that the defendant is guilty.
Yeah.
If he doesn't show that, then that's it. It's not his job.
The
In
defense
other
did a
words,
bad, or
the
the attorney
defendant
did a bad
attorney
job.
can beg the question all he wants, if I'm going to use that terminology. He can beg the question and assume the defendant as guilty or not guilty, whatever, all he wants, because it's not his job. It's only his job to remain skeptical.
Yeah.
So
And I
put
think
it back in terms of the free thinking argument. We're the defendant, the determinist, the defense attorney, and Stratton's the prosecuting attorney. It's his argument. He's the only one that can beg the question, and we're just remaining skeptical.
Mhm.
So I'm just continually baffled why he thinks that we're begging the question just because we're relying upon rational faculties in order to show his argument to be false. It
Well,
makes no sense to
the
me.
only way he could be right is if in this conversation I brought to him my thesis. Well, it can only be one of three things, like I described: determined and morally culpable,
Right.
determined not morally culpable, or it doesn't determine not morally culpable. Then he could be a defense on that, to where I'm making a statement, or introducing like a new argument based off of his information,
Right.
and then he
Right.
could poke holes and be skeptical of what I'm saying, and then it would be my job to not beg the question and defend what I'm saying, right? So
Right.
that's almost like just changing it from his argument. Okay, I understand your argument, but here's my argument to that. That's a new starting point. And then at that point, I could be begging the question if it went that direction, which happens a lot. I feel like on these forums that someone has a statement, makes an argument, someone says, no, I don't agree with that. They make their own argument. And then the original author starts attacking that argument. And at that point, that person could be like, oh, you're begging the question. Like, no, I'm poking holes in your new argument that you made. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not always whoever has the first argument isn't allowed to question beg at all, because it could end up, if the argument goes on further and a new argument gets introduced, that the original prosecutor can now become the defendant. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, I think it really just depends on the dialectical situation.
Exactly.
So it is the positive and negative argumentation route. So whenever I think Stratton thinks that whoever's just making a claim, then you have to prove it, and you're begging the question if you can't prove it. And I disagree with that.
Yeah.
I think whoever makes the positive claim,
Yeah.
then they need to prove it.
Yeah.
And so I can make negative claims saying, hey, that premise is undefended. Here's why it's undefended. And then I can beg the question. I think it's okay for me to assume my position, my determinist position, while negatively critiquing his premises. Now, if he were then to come back and say, okay, I see your point. Can you give me an argument of how this would look, or maybe for your own position
How
with
would you
that
explain
same
this?
defense?
Yeah.
And then, okay, then it switches. And so the dialectical is now on me, and I would have to give a reason for my position, like for compatibilism, whatever, and how it doesn't rule out God's omnibenevolence, blah, 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 and his determining, blah, blah, blah. And so that's a little bit different, right? And so I think um, his failure to understand these dialectical switches and when arguing, it is really what is the demise of his premise.
Yeah.
The best premise
And
in the
and
history of
yeah, and
argumentation.
what I find with some people too is that you'll make charges against them. And this is what I did with Drew. I'll just hand up because he got me with special pleading where I pretty much told him like I don't have a good answer for you, so how would you answer it? And I did it pretty blatantly. I pretty much said that. Like I conceded that point to him. But what some people would do is they have their argument, you insert your skepticism and questions and ideas about it in the negative sense, and then they wouldn't even talk about those points. They just skip over. It's like, well, how would you answer it? And then now you're on the defense without them even talking about what they said. And it's like, well, it doesn't matter what I say. I want you to react to the points that I brought up. And I'm not saying Stratton does that, but it happens all the time to where you're now in a defensive and oftentimes you don't have a good answer as to why these things are, or, it's not easily defensible because you haven't been thinking about it. It's like, come up with something off the top of your head in 5 minutes or else, and I'm going to rip it to shreds, like it's not going to be that well thought out. But I feel like some people who argue online like to do that. But I guess all this to say, first of all, ridiculous. I think it's a ridiculous premise. I hope we showed you a little bit of why it's ridiculous. And I hope we showed you too that even if we think about it and deliberate with our own faculties and our own free will, I guess you could call it, that doesn't mean that Stratton's ultimately right just because we consider it as an option, which is
Right.
a hilarious premise to hold to.
I mean, he wants to think that people haven't responded, or that it's this best premise or the best argument against. I know he doesn't say this, but I wouldn't doubt if he thought this at one time, that it's the best argument against divine determinism, and it's just not. There's people who've responded to better articulations that he's trying to show the
Mhm.
incompatibility of divine determinism and deception and God's omnibenevolence. There's better arguments in the literature that show that, and yet they still fail. So that means his argument, because it's weaker, is obviously going to fail. So
Yeah.
this is one book. It's called The Challenges to Divine Determinism. It's called by Peter Furlong. He's not even a determinist. Okay, so he's
And he
not
could
even a
tackle
determinist.
this.
He's not a compatibilist. He's agnostic about that. And he responds to this exact argument. So deception, if God determines some things, that just means that we can't obey the things that he does, so we just do what he determines. Does that mean if he commands us to do this, though he determined us to do something else, does that mean that he's deceptive? He responds to that argument in his book, page starting at 188. You know what he says?
Hmm.
Sucks. He says the argument sucks because compatibilists have really good answers for this, one of which being intentions, the other of which is different kinds of ability and counterfactuals. Lastly, they just have good answers to the problem of evil, and you can just push this whole Stratton's argument into the problem of evil, and we've already talked about all
Exactly.
that.
That's where I would go with it too.
And so he's like, and I quote, if one is a compatibilist, then this larger problem of deception, God determining, being deceptive, cannot have failed to present itself. Thus, it is safe to assume that any particularized version of it, aka Stratton's, it poses no additional threat. It's just not a threat at all. And so he's not even a determinist, and he's saying that. So it's not like he cares about us.
Yeah.
Like he doesn't even care about determinists really. And he thinks it's false, and
Yeah.
he's not a compatibilist. Yet he himself is saying this is not really a good argument. That should speak volumes to those who uses Stratton's argument and says, "Oh yeah, divine determinism is therefore false." It just doesn't follow.
Yeah. Well, I had one other like kind of quick, somewhat silly thing we could talk about, or we could talk about something you want to mention, but I would say like 30 more minutes or so. I don't know where you want to go. Do you think you have time or to talk about your thing, or we could do that in the episode? What do you want to do?
I have time. We can talk about it.
Okay, cool. Can I like mention my somewhat silly
Yeah,
thing
go for it.
first? Um, and I knew I was gonna do this. I was thinking about this in the shower. I was like, I'm not really well prepared to talk about this, but I want to mention it. So, quantum physics, my favorite thing to talk about when it comes to determinism, because some people like to use it as a thing for like how things are not determined or things are random. I don't know, but I was reading up on it. It was part of the argument or experiment that got a Nobel Peace Prize this year, which is why I got into it. So there's some people on TikTok talking about the Nobel Peace Prize experiment, what it means and what the implications are. So it's talking about quantum entanglement. Do you know about what that is? That two electrons can become entangled, and even if they're separated in infinity in space, that they will still act in accordance to each other no matter where they are, up to infinity. So they were saying, so there is something in the universe that's faster than the speed of light. It has to be the information passing between these electrons, because you could separate them at a distance farther than the speed of light could travel, and they still act instantaneously. So a lot of people were like, well, either there is something faster than speed of light where information can travel pretty much at a instantaneous speed, or there's the many worlds theories where we are actualizing a world where they react the same, and that there's other worlds where those positions are different. So it's like depending on what one side does, the world is actualized where the other side does the same thing. So it's the many worlds theories is one way of explaining it. But what I think is going on is what they call super determinism, to where all of this has been determined throughout all of time, and that's the only way that those things are acting in accordance to each other, is because it's always been that way. So no matter what you do to this will happen because it's determined to be that way. And if you think about the double slit experiment, how if you're observing the experiment, they act as solids. If you're not observing it, they act as wave functions. Like it's determined. You could easily say that it's determined if the experiment's going to be observed or not is already known to the universe before it's known to the people running the experiment.
Right.
To where you could look away, wave function, look at it, and instantly see it starts acting like a particle. Or like they've even had people across the world just think about the experiment and get it to act a certain way. They've done so many things to try to trick it, to catch it acting differently when observed. Like they've literally tried everything and they cannot do it. Anytime it's observed, it acts a certain way, and anytime it's not observed, it acts a different way. And I truly believe there's only two options: the many worlds theories and parallel universes and all that, or super determinism. I just thought it was interesting how even in randomness we see determinism happening on an observational level in scientific experiments that are baffling scientists to the point where like we have no idea how the structure of reality works, because these seemingly random objects are acting perfectly in sync. And that's in relation to time and space, and even outside factors that are acting on them. It's just completely, it's bad shit insane, honestly, to consider the implications of quantum mechanics when it comes to spirituality. And I really feel like there's only two options. So that was just one thing that blows my mind constantly about what they've been doing in the scientific world. And I've been, Colin, you can attest to this, I've been talking about this for like almost 10 years now when I first heard about this experiment. So it's been a long time, and the more they research it, the more and more we see that there is things in line in the universe that just don't make any sort of sense if you believe in the randomness of events. So it's just crazy to think about. Like maybe even God like super determines everything down to the particles, even the random quirks that I'm pretty sure we were never supposed to find in the first place. But it's just weird. I don't know. That was my point. I don't know if you have anything to add. I just think it's cool.
No, I think it is cool. I don't have anything to add. I'm not you know way more about the quantum realm than I do, so.
And you're a math teacher. That doesn't make any sense. Just YouTube
I don't
it.
teach quantum mechanics. And honestly, a lot of quantum mechanics has to do with physics and science. So
Yeah.
it's not much.
It's like it's like theoretical physics.
Right.
But we're starting to turn those theories into things we can observe, which is crazy that we have the technology to do that type of stuff. Actually insane. But yeah, what was your thing? I sound so excited. It's gonna be super boring, isn't it? It's gonna be just so lame.
I think that's what my wife said. So
oh, she said it's super boring.
No, she's like, what'd she say? I can't remember what she said, but she's like, she doesn't understand it.
Okay, so. I'll try to understand it, but if she can't, I probably can't because she's way smarter than I am.
So this idea is, basically it's called the aiming at truth objection. To divine determinism. Stratton is one who's pressed it, but there's other, incompatibilists who have said something very similar. Whether it be a pop apologist, I think Leighton Flowers he's a provisionist. He has said something similar. Other indeterminists have said something similar. It's really this idea that if God were to determine all things, including beliefs, theological beliefs, then couldn't God just determine every single person to have the same true theological belief? Like, couldn't he just determine everyone to just believe truthfully and to not believe something that's false theologically? And I think it's a pretty good argument, and I think it's relatively, I don't know, argued well, but it really has to do with this that idea that God can just determine all things to be just true. And so really it has this idea, if I can find it, that to quote Stratton, because he has argued it, but he's not the only one who's argued it, but he has argued it, he's written on it, that if determinism were true, and he says this in his rejoinder to Bignon, page 33, if determinism were true, then we would all arrive at the same conclusions in light of the same evidence. God would not determine some to reason one proposition and determine others to reason a different proposition or a contradictory proposition. And so I think it's a really interesting argument. So that's basically the thing that I wanted to respond to. What do you think about his claim here?
Well, I think it's a better version of the argument we just talked about earlier. Like, that's when you're talking about steelmanning an argument, that would be the steelman of his earlier argument, I feel like. So could God determine all people? I feel like no. Given our physical nature, like just our minds and how we're made up, I feel like we are wholly incapable. Like we don't have the physical capabilities to even understand truth the way that God does. I feel like it would kill us in these mortal bodies that we have, which is why when new heaven and new earth, we get new bodies because these bodies have
Right.
limitations. And I feel like mental capacity to understand truth is definitely one of them. Could God determine that we do have the physical ability to understand truth? Also, yes, which I feel like I could easily say he does determine that. It's just not right now. That happens in the future. So it's not like, I mean, obviously the answer is yes because we see it happen eventually. But
Right.
why does he not do that right now? Which is kind of the same question as like, it's very adjacent to the problem of evil, just almost a different flavor of
Right.
it.
Right.
Um, I mean, obviously there's no rock solid answer because he could. Reasons why he doesn't is like me trying to explain to somebody why you would. What was your reasons for wearing that shirt? I don't know. Looks kind of fruity. But I know
Sure.
it's a lot more important of a question than that. Um, uh, it's faith. You can't have faith if you're determined to believe truth. I think that's part of it because part of faith is believing in something that you don't entirely understand. That would be part of it, I think. Because if
That's
you
not
just
what I've said, but I think that's a good answer. I mean, it would be your defense if we push this objection as a problem of evil concern. That would be a pretty good defense, I think, that faith is necessary in order to try to make you into a better human being, to prepare for heaven. I think that's what Peter says in First Peter. So First Peter chapter 1, and I think it's the trial of that faith is what something that the angels don't have, but we do. And
yeah.
it is a blessing. And so that could be one reason. I think that's perfectly fine. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, well, I think you'd agree with that. Pretty good. Just pulling out of my butt. But
It's not
you,
what it's not what I've
yeah,
initially said.
yeah.
But I
But you
think
get what I'm
it's a
saying. Like if you know and if you understand completely, then you can't really say you have faith in it. You know
right.
what I mean?
Yeah, like I don't think the angels have faith. I think they believe God,
Yeah.
just like the devils believe in God, but that doesn't mean that they have faith, right? And so, and I think I similarly, I don't think that the angels don't have faith in God per se. They believe in God and they believe that He is the Lord and Savior, but they're with Him. They don't need to necessarily have faith in the evidence of things not seen because they see um, what He has done and who He is and so forth.
Well, we
And
have we have like faith in a future where there's things in
right,
Revelations that we understand that I don't think the angels do at all. I think that they're like in the moment just going about their business and they have no inclination of what the future holds. I think that that's part of it. And I
I
know
think
that
that's true
we
too.
that we have an elevated status over angels, and the reason why that is you could say faith. The fact that we've in a sense ate the fruit, but still decided to seek God's His redemption and His love, and even
Right.
after eating the fruit, realizing that it wasn't all that cracked up to be like we didn't fall for the lie. But why doesn't He determine everybody to do that? I mean, that's basically saying, why isn't everyone a Christian? Why isn't everyone a believer?
Yeah, it's so for me, if
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
you allow me, I think I'm going to take a strong. I think you're taking a weak response to it, and that's fine.
Hmm.
I think it can work at least to fend off some potential objections, but if they come back and the other side makes it a little bit stronger, then I'm not sure it could do the trick. So I do a stronger defense, and I say perhaps God would not determine two people to have convergent beliefs, like you and I, to have convergent beliefs because we differ on things. Not a lot of things, but we still differ on things. Perhaps God could not determine or would not determine us to have convergent beliefs because he can't determine us to have convergent beliefs.
Why not?
And so this is very similar to transworld deprivation, where God can't determine all creatures to just um, be perfect. It's not exactly the same reason, but he can't. We would say, God, why doesn't God just determine everyone to be perfect and at heaven right away, all from the very beginning? Well, because we say God can't, and for this reason, that reason, whatever. And I would say something very similar here. God can't determine us to have just two people to have convergent beliefs, and so He can't determine any two other people to have convergent beliefs. And part of the reason why I think this is the case is because it would go against and circumvent their own dispositional environment. This is the term that I use, the dispositional environment in which they come to these beliefs that make them who they are. So if God, actually, let me be a little bit clearer. I think God could, but then we'd be the same person, like the
Exactly.
exact same person. So if he were determined you and I to have the exact same true beliefs all the time, there's no distinction between you and I, there would be no difference between you and I then. And that this is what in philosophy we call the supervenience claim. So basically looking at two related uh, pieces and saying that they're so related that there's no difference between them, that they map onto each other perfectly. Like your theological beliefs, if they were true, if God determined them to be true, and my theological beliefs, if God determined them to be the exact same beliefs that you have, I would say that means he must determine the exact same way in which we come to those beliefs. And if he determined the exact same way in which both of us came to those beliefs, and they though that way was the exact same, we would be the legit same person. And I don't think that God wants to do that. He doesn't want to make the
Okay.
exact same person over
So,
and over and over. Like there's no difference between persons.
so
And I
you're
don't think that forgiveness and truth and love and mercy are best seen when everyone is the exact same person.
See, this is a little bit different than I think that they imagine when they ask that question, because you could almost imagine them saying, like, couldn't God tomorrow just magically enter our brains and determine us to have all the same true theological beliefs? And that'd be circumventing our own agency to do that, right?
Right, right.
If God, so you could almost say that their premise in the first place is almost false, because we would say determinism doesn't work like that. God cannot determine somebody to basically circumvent their how would you say it, circumvent their own.
Doesn't determine us against evidence. So your evidence for believing, let's just say, for those listeners who have listened to our podcast, you should know, or at least have a hunch, that Shemez is a dispensationalist.
I am,
So
I don't know what that means, but yeah, sure.
you believe in the rapture.
Oh yeah,
So
something,
yeah,
some
so
form of it.
yeah, he believes in some form of the rapture and eschatology in the end times. I do not, and so
Sinner.
and
Have
maybe
you
we
heard
could
of
talk about it in a different episode.
the Yunkata guy in Israel? They're calling them the Messiah. You haven't heard
No,
about
I
this
didn't know
guy?
about that.
Well, they're worshiping him like he's Jesus, and he's performing miracles. Weird
Regardless,
stuff. I'm just kidding. But yeah, go on.
Shemez is a premillennial, so that's the fancy word for just believing in the rapture. and then I would be an amillennial. So there is no millennial kingdom, and Shemez would believe that there is a millennial kingdom. Why do I bring that up? So I bring that up because we have different evidence for why we appeal to those things. He
Yeah.
would say he has evidence, like he just said it, like, oh, they're kind of worshiping someone in the Middle East.
Well,
That's evidence
I had 3
in
years of
some
that getting
sense for
hammered
him.
into my brain at Grace, where or really it's 4 years of being taught that constantly. So it's kind of hard,
And
yeah,
it's
to not think
interesting
it.
because my college also was dispensational. They believed in rapture and everything. And yeah, I'm not. And so
Well, I had better
the
teachers.
but I have different but the point is I have different reasons and different
Yeah.
evidence for why I would appeal to that. And that Shemez may not have access to because he didn't read or uh, listen to some of the things that I did, but I didn't also read and listen to some of the things that Shemez did. So we have different evidence. If God were just to magically come in tomorrow and Shemez called me on the phone and says, "Hey, dude, like, I'm an amillennialist." I'm just using this for example. Like, I'm an amillennialist. I'd be like, "Wow, so am I. Like, how'd you get there?" "Oh, because of this, this, this." And I was like, "Dude, so I read that exact same article.
Hmm.
I like it's like what so what convinced you? Oh, this line. Dude, me
Same.
too.
Yeah.
But what's happening here? It would be cool. What's happening here is it's totally not in Shemez's character.
I
It's
wouldn't read
like
the
totally it's
article.
not like
I'm
how did you
watching a
get access
YouTube
to that,
video.
Shemez? And
I'm
then
playing
he could say
COD.
like, well, I just read it. I was like, how'd you read it? Like, oh, I just found it
How'd you find
randomly.
it?
Like,
Why'd you
oh,
want to
maybe it
read
was a
it?
book and it was just given to him. Like he didn't know where the book came from. Do you see what's happening here?
The paper
It's like
trail gets very
extensive
muddy.
evidence. What? Say it.
The
Sorry.
paper trail will get very muddy very quickly as to how
Right.
it
Right. And
came
I think
about.
that God when he determines via our dispositional environment. Disposition is just a fancy word for saying like my uh proclivity or my tendency to do this or that in this situation. And
Yeah,
because I don't think God can determine outside of our own reasons responsiveness, that means through our reasons we come to the propositions that we believe, and those reasons serve as evidentiary weight for why we believe what we believe. And if God would determine just Shemez or I to believe the same thing contra those reasons, then it doesn't seem like we came to those reasons on our own. And by own, I do not mean libertarian. I mean just through a natural means of reasons responsive, studying, and so forth, deliberation. And again, I don't mean libertarian deliberation. But I think that this is a cool way to think about it that, we are different people. We have different evidence. We have different experiences. We're different ages. We read different things. We have different environments. All these things funnel into our reasons responsive category, and that is how we come to the different beliefs. For all you know, the rapture or some form of it is true. And for all I know, some form of the rapture or whatever is false. And we're not going to say to each other, "Oh, you're not justified to believe that." Well, based on the evidence that we have, we are justified to believe it until new evidence comes up. Because then
exactly.
Shemez could say, "Well, have you read this?" "Well, I haven't." "Well, he says this and this." I'm like, "Oh, that's an interesting point." And then I start to evaluate that belief, and perhaps maybe I change it. But it's not against evidence. It's because I have new evidence in my repertoire in my
Hmm.
library that I can pull out of my memory bank and say, now I can believe this as good evidentiary weight. And
Yeah,
so I don't think that the argument works because it neglects these differing dispositional environments that intrinsically each person has, and they're different.
yeah. So you could say like, why can't God determine everyone to have the same theological beliefs? My answer, to put it shortly, is God can't determine something against your dispositional, what did you call it?
Environment.
Dispositional
Yeah,
environment.
dispositional environment. Yeah.
For that to happen, we would all have to have the same environment, the same evidence, the same thought process, the same experience, the same history, and essentially we'd be the same person.
Right.
And that's so you could say that it's an absurd proposition for because the way that it would happen is an absurd reality in the first place. That's not a
Right.
reality that is even accessible, um, or that we could feasibly see happening. Like, what if, or I saw a similar question from Tyler even today, like, what if, why can't God just write in the sky that, like, Jesus is God? Like, make, undeniable evidence that anyone could look up and see, and it's so clear. He's like, why can't
Right.
God do that? And as it kind of hurts hearing that from who I know now as an unbeliever. Um, but even if God did that, it wouldn't matter. Like, if He's
Right.
not going to circumvent our dispositional environment, I I commented on it. I was like, the fact that there's stars in the sky, it all should be evidence that there's a God. There's
Right.
millions and billions and trillions of galaxies out there, and we're the only living thing out there that it matters, that exists, that God cares for. Like, is that not like, look at Romans 1, like the evidence is everywhere. So it
There,
is,
there was God walked the earth
yeah,
in flesh. And what did they do? Oh, you're God. Let me worship. No, they crucified him.
exactly. The evidence can
It's
literally smack you in the face and it wouldn't matter. So it's like,
right.
it's a nice thought experiment, but there would be millions and millions of people who maybe that would be just enough to make them believe, which would be awesome. Like, why God doesn't do that, I don't know. It would be really cool. Um, but there be, still unbelievers. I, as a dispensationalist, is the word, right? Or a millennialist, I even believe that God will be the leader and king of earth, on the earth, ruling as a perfect leader in a perfect everything, with us, working as whatever, like governmental servants and in our glorified bodies. And there's still going to be a rebellion. Like 1,000 years of God's leadership, perfect leadership, everything's going well. And there is still going to be a group of people who will rise up and take Satan's side and fight against him in the final battle, I would say. Um, so yeah, it would take, a universe that is improbable for that to be probable, I think. Like, if there's one person left on the earth, that would work. But if there's two, it wouldn't work.
I think that's fair. Yeah.
Now, if they would agree with that, I'm sure they have something to say against it. Which I'm
So
trying to
then
think of
we
what
could.
they would say. Because I really think that, like, that like, the reason people ask that question is they don't understand that determinism necessarily does not circumvent your dispositional, or is that what it's called? Yeah, dispositional environment. That's not
Right.
what that equals. Now, if you thought that determinism could do that and would do that, first of all, it'd be absurd because, like you said, we'd be the same person. Um, but it would be a different form of determinism that I would find that nobody believes, because it's absurd to think that that's even possible in the first place. So they're arguing
Right.
against something that nobody even thinks in the first place, right?
Right.
Which, what is it called when you set up an argument that nobody thinks about, or like nobody holds true? Um,
That leads to absurdity.
yeah, like,
It's a reductio ad absurdum. You make an argument assuming the truth of the opponent, what you're going against, and then you're showing through the argument uh, that their premises lead to absurdity. What they hold to leads to absurdity.
well, that would be the goal of why they would ask that question, because that is an absurd thing, and I think that's where they're getting at. It would be absurd for God to do that, but you're claiming that He has the power to do that, and we would say, no, it's not absurd, because we don't think that that's possible, because the way you're describing determinism is absurd, because it's not the way we would describe it. So we would both agree that
Right.
that is absurd, but for different reasons.
Yeah, so it's very similar to, like I said, the problem of evil. Problem of evil basically says that God cannot be all good, all knowing, and all powerful while evil existing. And then Platinga, and in the 70s said, well, perhaps God can't actualize a world in which libertarian free creatures would do no evil. Like they're always going to do evil, and that's transworld depravity. And so what that means is it shows that the incompatibility of God being all good, all knowing, all powerful, and evil existing, that incompatibility is not true. That God could still be all good, all loving, all knowing, and yet evil still exists because perhaps he creates a world and he doesn't have any choice in creating a world where there's uh, free creatures yet evil. And it's very similar here. Perhaps God can't even determine a world in which free creatures, even compatibilistically free creatures, could come to the come to their rational faculties and believe just the true things. And the reason why is because, yeah, they would be, I think, the same person, which is absurd. And so I think it's, yeah, how you framed it is more or less how I would frame it. And it's very similar to stuff that we've already talked about with deprivation, the problem of evil, and so
Well,
forth.
it's kind of like an argument is like, why couldn't God like make water or like rain purple? Well, you could easily say he could do that, but given the laws of nature that we have now, that he created and set up beforehand, that is impossible for him to do because he didn't determine it to be set up that way in the first place. But like
Right.
it's only impossible because he determined it to be impossible. So for it to be possible would have to change what he already determined in the first place.
Well, that's actually interesting because you actually bring it up something that I haven't thought about, and
I
that
didn't think
is,
about
well, it
that
could
either
be a
too.
miracle. So
Yeah.
like God stopped the sun for Joshua, and
Hmm.
so that's a miracle. Well, that's a law of nature. God, we're not going to say that God couldn't do that per se, that God could do it. And so I do say in my response, God couldn't do it, but if he did do it, which he could do, um, it is absurd to think that he would do that.
I would even say even miracles, I feel like that there is some type of science that could explain it. Maybe.
That would be new.
Well, I'm
That
trying to
would be
think
strange.
cuz even being raised from the dead.
Oh, no, it's definitely not a naturalistic thing. Resurrection is a supernatural thing. It is a miracle, right? It's the most
Yeah,
prominent miracle
I'm trying to
is
think
resurrection.
if there would be like if anyone would hold the hypothesis that all miracles are just an amalgamation of just the most insane circumstances ever, that it would in our laws of nature actually make sense. But
Right.
it's just the circumstances leading up to that were just so impossibly like zero. Like I would even say life on Earth from a naturalistic point of view is illogically like there's 0% chance that this happens on its own, which is why people
Mm,
like Miss Curtis, who are evolutionists but also theists, she's like, that doesn't bother me because I see a God who is molding and creating and guiding these miserable, pathetic, one-celled organisms to becoming life. And I think that the only way that that happens is by divine intervention, because if you leave that to natural causes, it'll never occur. I don't know. So even like the miracle of life, if you want to say God created it, or even through theistic evolution, either way, it's a miracle. Either
yeah.
way, the
So,
only way it
for
happens is
instance,
by God.
let's think about like how someone could be converted. So, if someone's converted, there's a plethora of conversion stories that someone is an atheist and then they just are miraculously converted. Well, are we to say that they are contrary to their dispositional environment, that God just kind of zapped them to have true beliefs? And I want to try to press, and I'm on shaky ground here. I want to try to press and say no, because I still think that person would have reasons for why they believe what they believe. And that's all I think my response is entailed, that we have reasons for why we do what we do. and
Even if
it's
those
not
reasons are
contrary to
supernatural?
reasons. Say again?
Even if those reasons are supernatural?
Right. So like if I was converted or, let's just say Vela is converted back, um, I think he would have reasons for why he would believe. Now, I had a Greek, he was my New Testament professor. I never took Greek, but he was a Greek professor. My New Testament professor, he doesn't even remember how he was converted. He doesn't even remember the year. He just knows that he was once an unbeliever, like when he was in his teens, and then he just was a believer somewhere like in his 20s. And he just doesn't remember. He's like 80 some years old or something like that, right? And it always kind of struck me like, wow, that's kind of interesting. Like he doesn't remember. So if I ask him why did he become a believer, he honestly says, I don't remember. That could be a counterexample, but maybe it's just because he doesn't remember his reasons for why he became a believer
In the
doesn't
first
mean that they don't
place?
exist. Like
Well, I'm sure he could, like, if you asked him the more general question, why are you a believer now? What are your reasons now? He would
right,
have reasons.
but
So, what
that would be in his dispositional
are you
environment.
saying, like, beforehand, like the conversion? See, that's another thing when you say, like, the dispositional environment of people who are converted. I would say that I'm comfortable with it being determined because I feel like it's through a supernatural mean. Like in the Bignon story, when he's at church and he's about to walk out and he
Oh
gets
yeah,
a rush of cold air that makes him like rethink it and turn back around and talk to the pastor. He would say, and I would agree with him, that that was a supernatural act. That, you could maybe explain it that like the way he stood up and walked out the door, like he had a iron deficiency because his diet was weird and he didn't get enough sleep that night, and for whatever reason the blood was rushing somewhere else, and he felt like you could explain it scientifically or in a naturalistic way, but he experienced it as a supernatural act, I guess you could say, and that caused him to do something different. But I would say he still had the
mm,
dispositional awareness to feel that and feel convicted about like what he did after feeling that. And that was to turn around and talk to the pastor. He didn't do that because he felt a cold rush of rush air. He did that because it was a response to that, and it was something that he decided to do on his own. So I don't think truly that there's any point in a conversion story where there's not some element of the person going along with it and deciding that that's what they want to do too. So if you think about it in the sense of God doing that to everybody, well, you could almost change the argument from God can determine everybody to have the same theological beliefs if you just modified it to God could save everybody if he wanted to. I would agree with that statement. He could. So why doesn't he? Why doesn't God save everybody? Because he could do, I feel like he could, in theory, supernaturally act in everybody's life to get them over the hump to become a believer without circumventing their dispositional environment. And if you say that that couldn't happen, then you would basically be admitting that there's people that no matter what God does couldn't be saved. And if you're saying that, then you're saying that there's people who exist who no matter what God does, he couldn't save them. And the only way that happens is if God determines them to be that way in the first place by allowing it to happen. I'm still comfortable saying God could allow people to be born who are, no matter what happens, they're just dispositional, thoughts about God would make it
right.
extremely impossible for them to become believers. But why would God let that happen? Or how would God let that happen?
I think the why is just a problem of evil concern. So you
True.
just posit any problem of evil thing. But no, I think what you brought up is actually really intuitively powerful. I'm actually thinking like I never thought of it before, so it's actually really good. Um, because yeah, you would be committing to that I think let's go back. I would say that just God can't. And but you said, and I think I'm slightly agreeing. If you say that God just can't save everybody, then you'd be committing yourself then to the fact that God has determined people that God can, because of their dispositional environment, in which He's also determined that God can't save them. I think I would say if God were to determine a different dispositional environment, they would be saved, right?
Yeah.
And the reason why He doesn't determine some people to have a a dispositional environment that has the tendency to be saved, that leads to salvation, is for whatever problem of evil response you want to put in
Yeah.
there, right?
Well, personally, I think that there's truly people who go through their whole life, born and die, without God ever acting in a supernatural way in their life.
I would say acting directly supernaturally because
Yeah.
obviously the stars and
Well, that's why I kind of said supernaturally,
are
because you could
the
say like
law
that
built in as a supernatural means.
you could say that those are laws of nature. So those are natural ways, and that's a valid argument. Like you can see God in the natural means also. That's why they're without
Right,
excuse. But I would say even without God supernaturally acting in their life to to do the extra beyond expected, um you know, whatever, how we exist, like experience existence, that there is no rush of cold air, there's no dream, there's no, you know, random call from a friend where they say exactly the perfect thing. There's none of that. I think people can live and die without that ever happening to them, and not even at fault of their own per se. It's just like God doesn't know them. You know, at the end times, like, I don't know you, like, get away from me. Like, they
right,
just totally fly under the radar and never experience any type of contact with God outside of what's around. But even so, I believe people that live like that could still be believers, because there's enough evidence elsewhere in the Bible and in the natural ways that like you could never experience like some high emotional thing but still be a believer. But that would be because you have the dispositional environment to where that's possible. Like, you know, a Christian, or you found a Bible and it's translated in your language, and you happen to be alive during a time where that Bible is widespread. You could even say that the fact that the Bible is so widespread nowadays is a supernatural act of God.
right.
So maybe that conversation could work for people who lived like 300, 400 years ago, and obviously previously to that, and even some of the very rare uncontacted tribes, and cultures that are very closed off to Christianity. That God would have to act in a supernatural way for them to have any chance at being a believer, which happens. Um, but maybe you would have to have the dispositional environment to want to experience truth, and you would seek it out and beg for it and want it and have a thirst for it, and God would fulfill that thirst. That's why I say if you truly want to know truth, like if you're actively searching for it and that's really what you want, I feel like God will always show up. If that's a pure goal that you have. That's a personal belief of mine. Um, but I don't know for sure. It's an interesting concept. But just the general question of like, God could in theory save everyone, why doesn't he? It,
Right.
it's like, it sucks. Like if I were God, I maybe would save everybody, but there's reasons why he doesn't. And I mean, I think the part of me that doesn't understand evil enough or in depth enough, I would have to say that that's probably why I would want God to save everybody, because there's people who have lived and died and who are alive right now, that they're beyond redemption. And for them to
Right.
burn in a lake of fire for an eternity is justified 1,000 times over. Um, but not everybody's like that. But everyone's like that to God. You know, it's just we sometimes see bigger examples of what maybe God sees in everybody. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling, thinking out loud, but
No, I think it's good. Yeah, it's just. I mean, we started the conversation by just something that I've been working on and thinking about. So
yeah,
obviously, it's not done. It's not complete, right?
yeah,
But I think it's a good objection, first of all, from the incompatibilist side.
hmm,
It's very similar to the compatibilist free will defense that we try to offer with deprivation. And so, some of these responses that you brought up with like miracles and untouched people and um, just different things that the other side could appeal to is very, very intriguing. So perhaps we'll talk about it throughout the episodes again, or have a whole episode
hmm.
again just about this one topic. It's really interesting. So it's not done. It's just something that I've been kind of thinking about. It is in my volume to reply to Stratton, but I only mention it just briefly and maybe have like a page or two on it, but that's about it.
You know, part of I don't know if this is a good thought to have, but I don't even think I necessarily believe it either. But maybe like if you want to get really wild, the reason God doesn't save everybody is because God doesn't have a use for everybody in eternity. He only saves the people that he needs. There's a set number. He needs a group of people to accomplish the goals that he has in eternity, and not everybody is part of that plan.
That's pretty wild. uh, he could determine everyone to have. I was an incompatibilist, I could say. He just could determine everyone to have, you know, just a use,
A use, yeah.
you
Well,
know.
I mean, I can easily say he doesn't. He doesn't have to, or it's impossible for him. But we're talking about a future that we have no idea what it's going to look like.
Right.
But at least like for me, like when I think about like my faith, I think of it in terms of like when I get to heaven and all throughout eternity, like I will have a very specific job that only I can do because of my history and relationship with God and how I lived my life and how I died. Like it's perfectly tailored to excel at whatever position that is once I get to heaven. And only I can do that job. Now, if you
Right.
think about that and apply it to all believers, then the people who aren't believers, it's like he didn't have anything for you guys to do. He didn't need you. He didn't want you. There's no use for you. But then you get, maybe everyone gets saved eventually. Who knows? You might have to go to hell for a while. And then you beg for his forgiveness, and he's faithful and just at that point. That even though you went to hell, he can save you and yada yada, which would be cool. Like maybe that's how it ends up. Like one of those universalist types. Um, it's like you'll all get to heaven, but some of you are gonna be burnt to a crisp. I don't know.
Yeah. Determinism has been long compatible with universalism.
Yeah,
I'm I'm not convinced that universalism is true, but
yeah.
right.
It's so hard because there's so little information about it. So it's like we could go with what about of isms like back and forth all day about that side of it because we just truly have no clue. Um, like there's there's realities that are equally possible on both sides. I feel like, but I guess the initial premise I feel like is an absurd reality because that's not how determinism works, nor the nature of reality. Um, but if you modify that question, like why can't God save everybody? That's a conversation we can have, and we can go back and forth with incompatibilists about the reasons why God doesn't save everybody. And even if you're a determinist, does that mean that God doesn't save everybody? Because you could easily say, well, God does save everybody. Some just go to hell. I don't know. Like
Yeah.
it's weird, Obviously, we don't have the answers right now, but think about it. I have to pee really bad, so we should wrap up.
Yeah, let's wrap up. It's getting late.
Do you have any code words for us?
Tiramisu.
I don't even think that's how you say that. I think it's tiramisu. Tiramisu.
My wife just made tiramisu, so for Thanksgiving.
It's not tiramisu.
That's how she pronounced it. That's how I pronounce it.
Tiramisu. I gotta look this up.
Tiramisu.
How do you say tiramisu?
Tiramisu.
No way. She's right.
I told you.
Buongiorno. We are looking at how to pronounce with the typical Italian pronunciation the name of this classic Italian dessert made and known all around the world.
Okay, this guy's obviously
Do you know
legit.
how to pronounce it in Italiano? This is, of course, a traditional coffee-flavored
Italian
dessert made of ladyfingers.
Just say
coffee.
it. Hold on.
Tiramisu. Is and flavored with cocoa on the top. The absolutely delicious tiramisu. The name literally translates into pick me up or cheer me up because it's got some coffee and some
tiramisu.
cocoa on the top. The absolutely delicious tiramisu.
Tiramisu. I guess it is. That's very close. Yeah. I thought it was tiramisu. It's tiramisu. Dang it.
We could say Augustine instead of Augustine.
Yeah, what's the right way to say his name?
I think it's Augustine.
Augustine.
I'm pretty sure.
Whatever. All right, tiramisu. Anna's right about something again that I don't know about. Whatever. All right, sounds good. We should start dropping code words like in the middle of episodes, because people might catch on and just skip to the end. Look for it. Whatever. All right. Like I said, if I can recover that video, I will add it to this. If not, that just sucks, and it'll have to be something we talk about at another time, which is fine. Just wasn't, God didn't determine it to be in the video. So we'll see if he determined it or not, if I can figure out how to recover it. It's a joke, kind of. I really hope I can recover it. I'll see you guys. Bye.